Should we get started?
Okay. Yeah, let's start. It looks okay now. I'll let you know if it blurs again.
Okay. So hello, everybody. Are you at the right session? Collaboration, the key to creating inquiries and enjoying it. Welcome. We're so glad you're here. I am Stacey Woodward, and I'm a disciplinary literacy and social studies consultant at Oakland Schools in Oakland County.
And I am Molly Gale, and I work with Stacey at Oakland Schools, where I am also a social studies consultant. So if you haven't had a chance yet, just go ahead and drop your district and role in the chat for us, so we can get a feel for who's here.
And we will share the slide deck at the end, so that you don't have to feverishly take notes and screenshots and all that. So, okay. So we figured we'd start with a little connector activity to get us thinking about inquiry. So what we'll do is we'll watch a short video, and we will then have a quick discussion about what resonated with you. That's all you really have to pay attention to.
In the Order of the Phoenix, the fifth of the Harry Potter series, Dolores Umbridge takes over as the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher and instantly transforms the classroom into this textbook-based, standardized, test-focused classroom. And Harry questions whether this will prepare them for fighting against Voldemort, he who must not be named, and that's when Umbridge punishes him. And he ends up forming his own school within a school called Dumbledore's Army. Now, Dumbledore's Army is purely inquiry-based. While Harry is the teacher, he is mostly the guide on the side, empowering students to ask questions and find the answers themselves. They rely on each other and on various spell books to solve problems and answer their questions. It is a space of experimentation. And while the process might seem messy compared to Umbridge's standardized approach, the students learn at a rapid pace because they aren't wasting their time repeating what they already know. This is an example of inquiry-based learning, although since it takes place in the UK, it's probably inquiry-based learning. I don't really know. Inquiry-based learning has existed for thousands of years. Both Socrates and Confucius used variations on their own inquiry-based format. It's a critical component to the scientific method of the early Enlightenment, and it was a core idea of both Dewey and Montessori's ideas around student-centered learning. Padaste shares a model of the 4 phases of inquiry. It starts with orientation, which is often a form of discussion. It's where they become aware of the key idea. And from there, it moves into conceptualization, where students generate questions and they define a hypothesis. This leads to an investigation phase, where students explore, experiment, and interpret data, often in a way that's flexible and dynamic. It can even seem kind of cyclical. And then finally, they move into a conclusion. Heather Banshee and Randy Bell define 4 different types of inquiry that you can view on sort of a spectrum from teacher-centered / structured into learner-centered / open. Level 1 is confirmation inquiry, where the teacher teaches the concepts, creates the questions, and models the process for students. They basically just kind of go along with it to learn about the process. Level 2 is structured inquiry, where the teacher creates the initial set of questions and kind of shares the procedures, but then the students walk through the rest of the inquiry process by collecting and analyzing the data and drawing their own conclusions. Level 3 is guided inquiry, and this is sort of the beginning of what we typically think of as inquiry. This is where the teacher provides the initial research question or questions, but students own the research process and the experimentation. And then level 4 is open inquiry or true inquiry. Here's where students formulate their own questions, design their experiments or their research, and collect their own data or facts, that they then share in their findings. Here are a few places where you as a teacher can start with inquiry-based learning. In a language arts or social studies class, you can do a Wonder Day or Wonder Week project where students develop their own questions and move through the inquiry process on their own. You can also do a Genius Hour project where students not only ask their own questions, but design their own product as well. In math, you could have students explore a concept and develop their own problems, which is one of the things I love about the What Can You Do With This process of Dan Meyer. And in science, you could do something like a science fair project or a Mythbuster style approach to testing an urban legend. The key idea, though, is this. If we want students to own their learning, if we want them to remain curious, if we want classrooms to be bastions of curiosity and wonder, well, then we need to have something like inquiry-based learning in place so that they learn how to ask great questions, find the answers, and share their results with their peers.
Okay, so I'm with Michelle. John Spencer has some great stuff. That was a John Spencer video, and I recommend checking out his website and getting on his email list, and he'll send you all kinds of great stuff. So let's just have a quick, for a couple minutes, discuss what resonated with you from this video. And you could drop it in the chat, or you could unmute and share, whichever you prefer is fine by us. Just what resonated with you? A Mythbusters Day sounded interesting. Yeah, I agree. That would be fun. I think kids would be into that. I think I'd be into that too. I like the idea of students having choice in their inquiry, such as implementing some sort of Genius Hour. Yeah, that's great. Has anyone here tried a Genius Hour approach before with their students? If you have, we'd like to hear about it later. Student led, yeah. That resonated. A couple other ideas, anything else resonate with you? I love the idea of giving students time to pursue their passions, ignite the fire of learning, and get excited about being involved in their own learning. Yeah, me too. I really like the idea of students taking the lead with creating their own experiments and sharing what they've learned. Yeah, I think the idea of sharing at the end is something that we often feel like we don't have time for, but it's an important piece of the learning. Great. Well, that was just meant to sort of get us thinking about inquiry-based learning and set the tone for how there's not one answer to what it is and what it can look like. And I'm going to hand it over to Molly, and she's going to talk a little bit about what we mean when we're talking about inquiry in social studies.
Thanks, Stacey. Yeah, and we're going to do this impressively in less than 5 minutes, so it's going to be fast. But this is what happens when they only give you 50 minutes for a session. So, okay, so when we talk about inquiry in social studies, what we're really talking about is really a shift in practice. So if you look at the left side of the screen and you kind of skim through some of those descriptors, if you're anything like me, that sounds a lot like what the way I was taught social studies largely in school. And to be very honest, it was the way I taught when I very first started my career. So a lot of teacher transmitting knowledge, maybe one textbook is the central resource, and really answers were what were prized in the classroom. So in inquiry, we're making a shift, and we're putting the higher quality. What we're looking for is the questions, not the answers. And we're having kids dig into multiple sources, not just one. And we're having them ask questions and make connections. So this is really the shift we're talking about when we're talking about inquiry today. And we're hopefully going to give you the steps to get going on designing your own. Yes, Michelle, I totally agree, by the way, in the chat. So in the video, they briefly said there's sort of a scale, there's a spectrum. So inquiry, when I first heard about inquiry, I envisioned it as this like free for all where kids were just designing their own questions and researching whatever they wanted and everybody was doing their own thing. And I will be honest that it scared me a little. But in reality, inquiry, there's a spectrum. So if you look at this metaphor on the slide, on the left side, we have structured inquiry. So this is where the students are going to follow the lead of the teacher for the entire class period, and they are going to engage in an inquiry together. So you've got, the little kids, they're holding onto the side and the teacher's directing them. But notice that the kids are in the pool with the teacher. So they're doing the work with the teacher. They're not hanging out in the bleachers eating popcorn and watching the teacher in the pool. And then as you move to the right, further and further, more and more of the control is handed over to students. So by the time you get to the very far right of the pool, the students really are choosing their own topics and there is no prescribed outcome. So take a look at this and then you can pop this in the chat or unmute if you're feeling like you want to chat out loud. What do you see here? And you can answer any of these. Where do you see yourself in this? And where would you like to be?
Okay, I will chat a minute, even though it's being recorded.
Thanks, Michelle.
I think that this image is fantastic because I think at different times and for different reasons, depending on the purpose and the group and the time, you may wish to be in any of these spots. And this is such a great way to be able to say, this is where we are and this is why. I love it.
Thank you so much. And Stacy, I see you said you're right now probably at controlled inquiry, but would like to move further to the right. Heather, structured and controlled. Yeah, great. Well, we know that you're interested in inquiry by virtue of you choosing this session to come to. So everybody is at least looking into the pool at some point.
I think I also want to say that something I like about this is sometimes we get the idea that like the goal is to be all the way to the right in free inquiry and like you're not like doing something wrong if you're not. And that's not the case. There are lots of really good reasons to be all the way on the left-hand side and doing structured inquiry. For instance, if kids can't swim, you wouldn't toss them in to that end of the pool yet, right? There's a good reason to be in there sort of together. So this isn't meant to say, you're here and you need to be over there. It's, you need to be where you need to be. Also, it could be that like for part of maybe like a unit, some of it is really structured inquiry because that's just what's needed. Kids maybe don't have the background knowledge or content knowledge yet. And then there's pieces of it. Maybe it's how they're demonstrating how they're, learn something in the assessment or something where it's more free inquiry. So even within one inquiry, you could be in different parts of the pool, so to speak. So it's not one thing.
Thanks, Stace.
You ready to move on, Molly?
Yeah, let's move on just for the sake of time. So we want to give you a chance to experience an entry point for an inquiry. So in an inquiry, this part of the process is called staging the question. So we're going to walk you through how we would stage the question with kids. So on the next slide, you are going to see a photograph. I want you to take a look at it for a minute. And then when you're ready, and you can again unmute or put it in the chat, I just want to know what you see. So you don't need to draw any conclusions or add any more detail. Just what do you see in this photo? Okay, Frank, thanks. Yeah, city ravaged by tornado, natural disaster or a war-torn area. Thanks, Heather. Destruction, rubble, an old car. Good eye, Lindsay. I actually didn't see that car the first time I looked at this photo, so you're more perceptive than I am. Okay, anything else you see that's jumping out at you? Thanks, Steve. Telephone, telegraph poles, yeah. Okay, so now that you've made some observations, I'm going to ask you to do something else. What do you think about what you see? Now I want you to make some connections. What are you thinking?
I think Heather's already modeled a little bit of the thinking before. She couldn't help herself. And she talked about maybe guessing a time period based on the car. So that's an idea of putting some conjecture from what she saw. So that's a really good example of thinking about what she's seeing.
Yeah, and Frank, I think you did too, actually, earlier. You noted that you think it might be from a natural disaster, tornado. Yeah, good, Stacey. Was anyone hurt? When was this? We have a rough idea maybe of date based on some of the, like an automobile and some kind of telephone wires, but we're not sure. Yeah, Michelle, that's a great question. What's the scale of this? Was this intentional? Great question, Lindsay. So that Lindsay's sort of leading us into the third part, which is, what do you wonder? What are you wondering? I know, Lindsay, you said, was this intentional? Is there anything else you're wondering? Yeah. Did people die? Great question. Oh, Lindsay, I love that geographical question. You know, where is this taking place? Is this a US photo or is this somewhere else in the world? Yeah, Frank, what is that building? That could have been a number of things. Wondering if anyone was hurt. Great question. So what we really just scaffolded you through was the strategy, a see, think, wonder strategy. So that's a way that we can scaffold kids into how we analyze visual images. We're going to give you a little more information. So pairing this text with that photo, I'm going to give you a second to read it. And then when you're ready, what do you want to know? Now that you have this text paired with the photo, now what do you want to know? What are some questions you have? Yeah, these are all great questions. Like Michelle, you're hitting a little bit on the author's purpose. How could this have happened? That's a really great question. Yeah, what is Black Wall Street? Does anyone live there now? Have they rebuilt? So this is an amazing number of questions generated from just that one image and one very small piece of text that we actually did. How can we pursue the answers? So what are some ideas? How do we find out about these questions? And where would we research? What kind of sources would we look at? Start with Google. That's where I go. Any other ideas on sources? Yeah, listening to some stories, maybe some oral histories. Great. Yeah, thanks, Patricia. Tulsa news websites. See if Tulsa has their own history site. So if you are, if you're interested in this topic and you are wanting to know more, I'm going to go ahead and pop this in the chat. We actually at Oakland Schools are hosting next week. We're really excited. Dr. Scott Ellsworth, who's a University of Michigan professor, and we're going to run a session called Teaching the Tulsa Race Massacre. So this is a completely free session. It is next Wednesday for an hour and 15 minutes after school. So if you're intrigued and you want to know more, we would love to have you, and all of the information registers in that tomorrow. But now back to inquiry. So really what just happened here? So we're going to kind of pause and go meta for a minute. So the first thing is we picked a topic that we thought lent itself to inquiry. So not every topic is going to work well for an inquiry. You have to think, what is going to pique kids' curiosity and what are they going to be interested in? We wanted to leave you with more questions than answers. So again, we're really we're putting more emphasis on asking good questions, not on just explicitly getting the right answer. We walked you through the See, Think, Wonder so we could scaffold you through a visual source. We gave you a quote that we thought was provocative and would get you thinking about even more questions. And then we sort of started to think about ways we could pursue these questions, and you came up with some amazing places that we would start. I love the array of sources that you said we might dig into.
Okay, so Molly took us through how we might start an inquiry. Now, we want to take you kind of behind the scenes and what it would take to plan that. And that's just one of the pieces that you would need to plan. So here we go. So here is, if you're familiar with the C3 teachers or the IDM, this is what this is. And what we want you to do is to just look over this one pager of an inquiry briefly. And we just want you to think about, what do you notice about what it takes to plan an inquiry? This is one that's about the Korean War. And Molly has dropped the little link in the chat there. And I want you to open it up and take a look at it. And just look it over briefly and figure out, what is it that it takes to plan that. Molly, should we send folks to small communities to talk to each other?
Yeah, I think so. Let's send everybody for a minute or two.
Okay, we're going to send you off just for a couple minutes. And again, you're just looking over it and you're thinking about, what would it take to plan this? Okay. I'll send you there for how long, Molly?
I think let's just do 2 minutes.
Okay, 2 minutes.
It's going to be the fastest small community you've ever had.
And do you need help getting to your room? Welcome back. Hopefully you had a chance to talk about some things that you noticed. I'm going to talk you through a few of the things that we think you probably noticed. So one thing we want to say before we really get into it is that what you're looking at, if you're not familiar, is called the inquiry design model. And it's basically a blueprint or a piece of sort of almost like a graphic organizer that can be used to structure an inquiry. And really the first page of it offers a bird's eye view of the whole thing, beginning to end, the big pieces of it. And you'll notice it has questions, tasks, and sources. And one other thing is that the assessment is sort of built in all the way throughout. There's some formative pieces and summative built throughout. So that's something I want to say before we talked about the individual spots on the model. Okay, so here's a blank one. It's the same as what you were just looking at. And the first thing that you might have noticed is the role of questions. And in a C3 inquiry, there are two kinds of questions. They are compelling questions and supporting questions. We'll talk a little bit about more about the difference between that, but just know that questions really animate inquiries. In this case, it's teacher questions, but as you noticed in the staging the inquiry part, there are student questions too, and those also play a role in the inquiry. There are also tasks. So tasks are throughout. So it's at the beginning. You guys already had an example of a task. We did a See, Think, Wonder with photograph and words. So two different kinds of text paired together, and the task was a See, Think, Wonder. There's also tasks in the middle that are formative performance tasks that are connected to understanding the sources. And then there are tasks at the end that are summative. Sources. Okay, so sources are the thing. This is where students are getting the content. And it comes from a diversity of texts. And when we say text, we mean that in the broadest way possible. Like I said, you already looked at two texts so far in this little inquiry that we're talking about with Tulsa, and that is a photograph, one black and white photograph, and one little chunk of text. Those are two texts that you looked at. So you want diversity in terms of type, and you want diversity in terms of point of view. The sources also can help students answer the big question that's driving the inquiry. You probably noticed the staging the question at the top end. This is something, it's usually like, in a classroom, it's going to be like 10 to 15 minutes. You can think of it that way. And it really is designed to hook the learners in. And it's meant to generate, as Molly said earlier, more questions than answers. So you're trying to pique interest and get things going, and you don't have a lot of answers when you're done. Argument is a huge piece of this inquiry. This is also called an inquiry arc, this type of design for instruction and learning. And basically what ends up happening is kids answer the compelling question. At the end, they make an evidence-based argument. Those sources are the places where the kids gather the evidence. So it's really important when we're choosing sources so that kids are able to do that at the end. And something else we want to note is that there's a logic to this inquiry design model from top to bottom and left to right. So for instance, staging the question is at the top of the page because that's the beginning and it's where we want kids to start being interested. And the end is where they're showing what they learned. So it flows from top to bottom. And then there's left to right. So you want the questions to make sense and build a logic. The supporting questions build out. They're the questions that kids need to answer in order to answer the compelling question well. And those build from left to right. It's the sort of order that you go in. And then this is the part that makes people nervous. This is the taking the informed action piece. I think it's actually pretty exciting. It's pretty fun. It's where kids can take what they've learned and we'll say apply it to the real world in some way. And the real world, by the way, can be within the walls of the classroom. That's totally allowable. Maybe at the end, they're having like a Socratic seminar and a civil, reasoned, evidence-based conversation about a real important topic, for instance. That counts. But it could also be that kids are out in the community doing something with what they learned, right? It all depends on what you design. And if that's something that you're interested in thinking more about, there's this great article that, Molly already put in the chat that you could read later. And it's Peter Levine is one of the, authors of it. And it's really worthwhile read about taking informed action and like why to do it and how you might do it. So you can read that one later. So those are the big elements of the IDM. Let's just for a second talk a little bit about the role of questions. It's pretty important. And when you're designing an inquiry, this is something that I'm always surprised by. It takes longer than I imagine to get this part right, the compelling questions and the supporting questions. So what you have on the screen are two connected questions, but they aren't the same. One is a compelling question and one is a supporting question. If you could just unmute and tell us something you noticed about the difference between this compelling question and its supporting question. Or you can put it in the chat. You don't have to unmute.
The compelling question is big. It asks you to, it could go in many different directions. The supporting question is giving you structure for answering for the compelling question. So that would be like your evidence to answer, a part of evidence to answer the compelling question.
That's right. Frank, you get a gold star. And it sounds like Steve is agreeing with you that about the compelling question is definitely open-ended. It could be answered in more than one way. There's an argument to be made. It offers the possibility of a new perspective, Heather says, and the supporting question helps answer the compelling question. Yep, these are connected. And of course, this explains why you need more than one supporting question in an inquiry. That's why there's more spots, because kids would need to know more than the Townsend Acts to answer this question, right? They'd have to think about other elements of the war in order to answer that question well, right? Okay, so they're, like you said, the compelling questions are debatable, multiple answers. It's the rationale for the supporting questions, and they do inspire inquiry. This should be interesting, kid-friendly. The supporting questions usually are not debatable. They're notable, discrete, fact-based answers. And again, the way that they get the answers to those is they're going to pursue them and find them in the sources that you chose. And they're, by the way, a way to sustain inquiry. You might put two sources together that don't agree. That's a way to keep inquiry going. So the big idea is no matter what in an inquiry, learners always go into content or sources or text with questions. They're never looking at a text for the sake of looking at a text. They're always looking for the answers to these bigger questions or the supporting questions. And since we know it is very tricky to, as a designer, to get these compelling questions right, we're gonna give you this free gift from us. And it's a helpful little tool for thinking through when you're designing guidelines for developing compelling questions. And we dropped it in the chat there for you. You can look at it later. We still use this. We design this stuff all the time and we still come back to this. I'm like, wait, what are we trying to do here? What kind of question?
I was going to add, Stacey, there's no shame in changing your compelling question once you've already started building. We oftentimes get very far into an inquiry and we're like, we're asking the wrong question. And we go back and pull this out and tweak it and start over.
I would say it happens maybe 70% of the time, by the way. We might be almost done designing. And sometimes it's just a little tweak of the angle in. You're like, ooh, the question isn't, why did this happen? But the question is really, some other thing, some other like verb or content angle in. And sometimes it's just a little tweak and it makes all the difference. So that's there for you. And just keep working on it. That's how you get better at it. So from examples of compelling questions that we could imagine that you could design an inquiry around with the Tulsa race massacre would be these, right? So A big question to consider would be, how should we remember the Tulsa Race Massacre? Or what do we do when evidence of a historical event has been destroyed? I'll do a little giveaway here. With the Tulsa Race Massacre, the evidence was intentionally hidden and destroyed. And it took the work of historians, in fact, the one that's going to be run at the webinar next week, to help uncover what happened. And it took years of work and corroboration and what have you, to do that. And so it's an important modern day question about what do you do when history is hidden? How should we memorialize the Tulsa Race Massacre? The 100th anniversary was last year. There's already been some examples of what communities have done to memorialize it. And then what is the legacy of the Tulsa Race Massacre? And it could be in Tulsa, but also in our own communities. And, unfortunately, Tulsa is not the only example of racial violence and conflict in American history. So these we think are worthwhile questions for kids to take up and could work with that.
Okay, so what we would argue is that when you're designing these inquiries, because you can see there's a lot of elements that go into creating one, that collaboration is always better. So collaboration can take really a number of different roles. There's collaboration in the design process, and then there's collaboration when you're actually implementing it with kids. So just some ideas, and I'm not going to go over all of these, but one that is probably the most obvious one is sometimes it's great when you just co-design. So like we often find that we have a better product when we sit down together and co-design. But we realistically know not everybody has common preps or has time to work on that. So you also can design an inquiry and just have a colleague look it over and give you some feedback, because often the fresh set of eyes makes a huge difference. Also, don't hesitate to reach out to experts for sources or for partnerships. You can call a library. People love answering questions when you tell them it's for kids. Email a professor who writes about it and say, hey, I'm working on this inquiry. Can you help me with this part I'm stuck on? So anything in the design process where you can collaborate, it's great. Students too, don't hesitate to ask them what they're interested in, what question is going to pique their interest. You can run some compelling questions by them before you commit to one and probably save yourself a lot of time. And there's also collaboration when you're implementing. So you want to give kids a chance to collaborate. Inquiries are sort of naturally collaborative as they're analyzing sources and discussing and doing tasks. Also have a colleague hop into your room and watch while it's going and give you some feedback. So there's a lot of different ways that we can collaborate in the design and implementation. And I think as you start down this road, it's going to make the product just a lot stronger.
I just want to say something about this last one, partner with caregivers and community folks. Today, Molly and I were invited into a classroom. Just kids had some projects coming up and they were going to present to board members, and they invited us to come in, just give kids feedback on where they are. And it was good for us. Like, we were happy to be there, and also it was good for kids. Kids got valuable feedback and they got to practice presenting and what have you. So people are willing to do it for sure.
And Stacey, I think with that, we're gonna maybe we'll skip over this and just for the sake of time and just hop right into this example. This is actually an elementary classroom where the teacher had designed an inquiry and said, I'd really like for you to come in and see it. So Stacey and I went in, and this was a 3rd grade classroom, and they were investigating, correct me if I'm wrong, the question was about fixing the roads in Michigan.
We're looking at potholes.
Yes. So we're going to play this really short video for you, and just pay attention to 2 things. What is the role of the source the teacher uses? So one of her sources under her supporting question, you'll see revealed on the screen. So what role does that source play? And then what role do you see collaboration?
And I zoomed in on Southeast Michigan, our area. This is the same area we just viewed with the construction. And this is what the map looks like. So these are the reported.
Looks like a monster. We can't even see like the states or whatever, like the places.
Right.
Barely find.
So what is that really? Talk to your partners. What is that telling you? What do you think?
So hopefully you enjoyed that as much as we did. what did you notice about either the source or the collaboration you've seen? And you, again, you can unmute or you can throw it in the chat. What jumps out of you? And I should tell you, they were, I think, 2 or 3 days into this inquiry. So they were already like, they had done their staging the question. They had already done one of their supporting questions. And now they were in the middle of the next supporting question.
Source looked real world, what we adults would look at and get enthused, maybe not enthused as they did, but the aha moment.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Yeah, thanks, Michelle. The collaborative moment built excitement and validated their thinking. I couldn't believe how excited they were to talk to each other about potholes. Like, I was just blown away. I was like, this is amazing. And they, by the way, had very strong opinions about the potholes for non-drivers. So you can see as you're designing and you're going through this process, as you think about selecting sources and you think about how you want kids to interact with each other, keep in mind what the end goal is for what purpose you're hoping those will serve. So we want to give you some resources to get started as you start down this process of designing inquiries. So we're going to give you a few different resources and kind of walk you through them. And then hopefully when you leave today, you'll feel empowered to go out and try one. The first one is c3teachers.org, which I'm going to go ahead and pop into the chat. If you want to click that link and open it, and then I think Stacy is going to do that as well for me. So, oh, you know what, Stacy, we're getting the grace. Yeah, there you go. Thanks. So when you go to C3 Teachers, C3 Teachers is a national hub for the design process. And what's amazing about it is not only does it have templates for creating your own from scratch, even better, it has already created inquiries that you can use and you can adapt them. So you can use them as they're written, or you can make changes to them. And they're all designed to be edited by teachers. So if you go to that on the upper left and you click inquiries, it takes you to the filter selections, and you can really filter by anything. But what we would always recommend is not to filter by grade level, because it's a national hub. For instance, they don't teach Michigan history in 3rd grade in every state. So if you search by the subject, that usually gives you like a wider array of hits. So Stacy chose, I think, US history. And you'll notice that it has all of these pre-created inquiries, and it tells you what grade level they were written for, the topic of it. And then when you click one, and I'll just let Stacy pick whichever one she wants to click. Okay, so call for change. This is 4th grade out of New York. It gives you the compelling question that kids will be investigating. It gives you the supporting questions, the tasks, and all the sources. So when you, that's kind of your overview. And then when you click into the PDF or the Word doc, it actually has everything in there for you. So all of the sources are already in there, ready to go. All of the tasks are in there and ready to go. So if you're interested in trying one, but you're not quite ready to design your own, this is a great place to go to pull one just to try in your class. And again, you can certainly edit it. So if there's a source like you already use that you really love, you can add it to the inquiry. You can delete sources. You can alter tasks. So C3 Teachers is definitely a great place to start. This is just our little roadmap for you. And again, we're going to give you the slide deck in a minute. But if you're thinking about doing this and you're like, I'm in, this sounds great. Now what do I do? Start by thinking about something you're teaching in the next few weeks or the next month that you think needs a little more engagement. So is there something that you're teaching that you're like, use my old lesson plan, but I don't love it? And then find out what standards that topic addresses. So take a look at the standards, figure out what standard you're going to address, how long you have to teach it. So you have to get a feel for, is this going to be a 2-day inquiry or a 5-day inquiry? Consider your content angle. What is the angle you're going to go into this topic? Because that's going to help you craft a different compelling question. Brainstorm compelling questions, brainstorm supporting questions. Then you're going to start to brainstorm tasks and sources. And last but not least, you just start laying them out in the template and be prepared to make lots of changes, because I don't think I've ever written one where I have not had to go back and make changes. So we're going to give you this link. These are a lot of places to start for sources. There's really no one good go-to place. There's a million places to get sources, and it just really completely depends on your topic too. But these are some databases that we really like. For instance, like the Library of Congress, obviously has a massive database of primary sources, as well as Docs Teach. But again, you're certainly not limited to these. You saw the third grade teacher, her source was literally just a Google map. She just Google map and showed where the potholes were. So, you know, think big when you're picking sources.
Okay, so maybe, you know, we're 2 years into a pandemic and it's spring and you're like, okay, that's nice, but I do not have it in me to plan a whole inquiry and a whole unit and calm down. That's okay too. There's also a way to think about the way that model is set up, and just think about reworking maybe the way you're doing a lesson, like a daily lesson. And if you think about setting up your lesson around questions, tasks, and sources, you're ahead. And that's inquiry, right? That's the more structured inquiry. And that's okay too, right? So, you know, it's all about using the questions to help drive the inquiry and providing the space for kids to explore some worthwhile things in social studies, which is really what we want anyway. So that's some permission giving there. It is 7:29 and we've made it to the end.
It's really a miracle. We never stay on time. So this is a first for us. So as you're kind of wrapping up and heading out, if you can just drop some thoughts into the chat. What did you come in thinking and what are you leaving thinking? And if you didn't catch it yet, I did throw our, that was my alarm to remind me to log out of this, that you just heard go on. So the link to our slide deck is in the chat as well. And once you've jotted down your reflection in the chat, we're also going to give you our contact information. So if you're interested in learning more, or you are interested in trying an inquiry, but you're just not sure where to start, please feel free to reach out. We would love to help and support you and even just be a thought partner. And those are both of our emails at Oakland Schools.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for being here on a
Tuesday
night in the spring after 2 years of a pandemic. You're the best. Teachers are the best.